I told you, I won the bet. I knew she'd be the 10th. Ladies and gentlemen, I call the Readiness Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee to order. This morning we meet to mark up H.R. 2500, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2020. Over the past 5 months, the subcommittee has held events examining a range of topics, including the quarterly readiness report, the mobility and logistics enterprise, impacts on climate change and national security, military family housing, surface readiness, and fiscal year 2020 budget request for the military readiness and installations. We're not tired yet, but we've done a lot of work. These briefings and hearings, and combined with committee travel and bipartisan engagement from all of the members of the subcommittee, have informed this mark that is before us today. The subcommittee heard from military families with concerns about the management, oversight, and condition of military housing. In response, the subcommittee mark requires the military services to have a comprehensive tenants' Bill of Rights for residents of privatized military housing. The mark also prohibits the use of non-disclosure agreements in connection with entering into, continuing, or terminating a lease for on-base military family housing. The mark authorizes additional funding to address shortages in civilian housing and personnel to ensure the military services are provided effective oversight and providing military families with the quality housing they deserve. I should also note that our colleagues on the Military Personnel Committee have worked with us on this issue and are carrying out complementary provisions in their subcommittee mark aimed at the health impacts and environmental hazards in family housing. Recognizing the impact that climate change has on our national security and recent examples of how extreme weather events have affected military installations in North Carolina, Florida, Nebraska, this mark includes a number of provisions aimed at planning for installation resiliency. Highlighting a few key provisions, the mark requires the Department of Defense to develop installation master plan that assesses current climate vulnerabilities and plan for mitigating the risks to installations from extreme weather events, from sea level rise, wildfires, flooding, and other changes in environmental conditions. I should add, for California, earthquakes. The mark also limits the ability of the department to spend planning and design funds until it initiates the process of updating its building standards for military construction to ensure that the building practices and standards promote energy, climate, and cyber resiliency at the military installations. Finally, the mark requires all proposals for military construction projects to consider potential long-term changes in environmental conditions and increased frequent extreme weather events, as well as industry best practices to withstand such changes of weather events. In responding to environmental hazards associated with fluorinated firefighting foam, the mark makes a number of steps addressing this contaminant, and I want to thank my committee members for being on top of this. Specifically, the mark prohibits the uncontrolled release of fluorinated firefighting foam except in cases of emergency and requires the Department of Defense to issue a new military specification in preparation for banning the use of fluorinated foams by the end of the decade. Finally, the mark seeks to assist communities surrounding National Guard installations by authorizing the use of Defense Environmental Remediation Account funds to address exposure and contamination resulting from National Guard activities involving firefighting foam. The mark also includes a number of provisions aimed at improving oversight, management, and accountability in an effort to improve military readiness. It seeks to limit funding available to the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment until the Department submits a plan for improving the availability and accountability of the F-35 parts and requires the Secretary of Defense to develop material readiness metrics supporting the National Defense Strategy. It requires the services to develop a detailed plan for planning, programming, budgeting, and execution of funding that support the sustainment of weapon systems and equipment, and modifies the quarterly readiness report to Congress and Joint Forces Readiness Review to make them more relevant and useful from a congressional oversight perspective. While more details will be available at the full committee markup next week, the subcommittee makes a number of recommendations to include additional investments in military construction accounts, as well as key readiness enabling accounts that support maintenance and sustainment of weapon systems. Important investments that are required to continue supporting the readiness of our armed forces. I would like to just note, for the record, my continued frustration with the decision by this administration to circumvent Congress and attempt to use the Department of Defense funding to construct an unnecessary and inefficient border wall. I believe their decision to prioritize the use of the Department of Defense funding for a border wall over the investments in military requirements, such as reconstruction of military bases decimated by the hurricanes, is inappropriate, ill-advised, and very troublesome. Given the seriousness of this issue and honoring the tradition of keeping our subcommittee markup bipartisan, I understand that we will move further discussion on this issue to next week's full committee markup, where I look forward to what I'm sure will be a robust discussion. Finally, I'd like to conclude by thanking Ranking Member Doug Lamborn and his partnership on this subcommittee. We've worked very well together. I appreciate his friendship and his support on many of the issues, well, in fact, all of the issues, but one that I have thus far discussed. Doug, we work very well together. Members of the subcommittee, and I want to thank the members of the subcommittee, all of you who have brought to this subcommittee very, very important issues that are in your district that you're aware of, and I believe that we have dealt with all of them or nearly all of them. The members, beyond that, I want to thank the committee staff. Most of them are seated down there in front, looking very, very sharp, not exhausted from the extraordinary work that they've done, ready to go into next week. I think the mark before the members this morning is a good product. It's reflective of the bipartisan nature of the subcommittee, and I hope all of my colleagues will support it. With that, I'd like to turn to my friend and ranking member of the subcommittee, a fellow that has a lot of experience on this committee, Doug Lamborn. Doug, it's yours.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for those good words. And I will note for the record, you were the first one in the room this morning. It has been a pleasure to work with you and all of the members of the subcommittee on both sides of the aisle to produce this mark. Supporting our men and women in uniform and keeping our national defense the best in the world is a true privilege and honor. This morning, we meet to mark up H.R. 2500, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2020. As we transition to an era of great power competition, we owe it to the men and women in our armed forces to ensure that they have the training, equipment, and support necessary to maintain overmatch against our adversaries. We all recognize the negative readiness impacts imposed by the 2011 Budget Control Act. The continued employment of our forces for almost 18 years has also taken a toll. The services have made significant headway to recover lost readiness since we began increased funding in 2017. Unfortunately, all of that progress will evaporate if we waver now. The $750 billion top line requested by the President would go a long way toward ensuring that the Department of Defense does not have to mortgage today's readiness to pay for tomorrow's modernization. That said, I would like to commend Chairman Garamendi for working in a bipartisan way to complete the subcommittee mark. We have done some great work in areas that are important to our service members, their families, and the communities neighboring our military installations. This mark would, among other things, direct the Department of Defense to report on steps being taken to improve availability and accountability of F-35 parts, direct the Secretary of Defense to require product support managers to develop strategies to meet material readiness objectives for major weapon systems, fund all of the military construction projects submitted by the service chiefs, even in their unfunded requirements list, prohibit the use of non-disclosure agreements to connection with on-base privatized military housing, and to direct the military services to have a tenant's bill of rights for residents, improve the resilience of military installations without imposing costly and unreasonable bureaucratic requirements, direct the United States Transportation Command to prepare a business case for the proposed award of a global household goods contract, and require the establishment of an advisory council to ensure that the voices of all stakeholders, including service members and their families, are heard. Given the scope of that contract, Mr. Chairman, it may be prudent to have the Government Accountability Office review the business case analysis. Finally, the MARC directs the Department of Defense to ban all use of fluorinated firefighting foams by 2029 and prohibits uncontrolled release of those foams except during emergencies. Now let me finish by addressing a vital issue we do have some differences on. It is nearly impossible to dispute that we have a crisis on our southwest border. As of the end of April in this fiscal year, the U.S. Border Patrol had detained over 460,000 people at the border, compared to 398,000 in all of fiscal year 2018. They apprehended almost 99,000 in April alone. The Department of Homeland Security is clearly overwhelmed, and I support the short-term use of our military to help stabilize the situation. In the longer term, support mechanisms through contracts or other means must be put into place so that we do not degrade military readiness. Although some of the President's actions regarding wall funding are new and have raised concerns among some in Congress, the use of troops to support the Border Patrol is not new. President Bush deployed National Guard troops to the border in 2006 to 2008 under Operation Jumpstart. President Obama did the same thing in 2010 under Operation Phalanx. We in Congress must do our part to address the border crisis, support the brave men and women in law enforcement, and remove the legal loopholes that prohibit deportation of undocumented immigrants back to Central American countries, and to allow the unlawful abuse of our asylum laws. We will undoubtedly have the opportunity to discuss this critical issue more next week. In conclusion, I do recommend adoption of our subcommittee mark, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back the remainder of my time.
Mr. Lamborn, thank you very much. We agreed to put one paragraph each on that issue, and we did. And your paragraph was longer than my paragraph. We will be taking this issue up in the full committee, and that's part of the work we do here, is to move some of these issues to the full committee, where the entire committee will be able to deal with some of these issues, this being one of many other subcommittees. Now, we will now proceed to mark up H.R. 2500, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2020. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. So ordered. The copies of our subcommittee mark and directive report language were made available and distributed to the member's office on Friday, May 31st. Is there any discussion or questions on the subcommittee mark? Ms. Horn.
Excuse me. I simply want to raise a couple of things and thank the chairman and the ranking member for all of the work, as well as the staff, all of the work that you did on this, and for visiting Tinker in Oklahoma to examine some of the issues that both the chairman and the ranking member have raised. The issues with housing and the work that was done are critical, not only for our readiness, but for our individual service members and their families, and also for the inclusion of direct hiring authority reform, which at installations such as Tinker is critical to helping us address the workforce issues. It has been a privilege to serve on this committee and watch the intentionality and the collegiality as well as the bipartisanship, and I just want to commend everyone involved in this subcommittee mark.
Thank you, Ms. Horn. Are there any other comments on the Republican side, back to the Democratic side? Very well then. If there's no further discussion, the chair lays before the members the text of the subcommittee mark for consideration. Without objection, the mark is open to amendment at any point. Are there any amendments? Tab 5. It's really important to have a good counsel next to you. Okay, the question now occurs on the adoption of the mark. So as many are in favor of it, they will say aye. 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 Those opposed? Hearing that there are no noes, the mark is adopted. There being no request for a recorded vote, we now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Kim, for the purposes of a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the subcommittee report the mark favorably to the full committee.
The question is on the motion of the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Kim. So many as are in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed? A quorum being present, the ayes have it, and the motion is adopted. And without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Without objection, the members have 5 legislative days within which to submit written statements for the record. So ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make necessary conforming, technical, and clerical changes and to remove from the mark provisions that would cause the mark to refer to other committees or would result in additional direct spending or result in an earmark. Without objection. So ordered. There being no further legislative business before this subcommittee, the meeting is adjourned, and I note that we did not beat the previous record of 9 minutes, 37 seconds.